Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to Physics 56th meeting. Today is the 5th of September. It's the first Wednesday of the month, as we hold our meetings on the first Wednesday of the month, unless that day is not going to garner many people due to some festival or whatever, then we will shift it to the next Wednesday. So I'm so happy to see all of you here present today, and there are about 11 of us here. There'll be more jumping in, I know, later on. And welcome, everyone. Welcome. We have Ulf is here as well. Hi, Ulf. Don Estes has been with me right from even before anybody else comes in. Thank you so much in the Zoom room. Press came in as well, and then we have Greg and hi, James. James is the sponsor of our Zoom room for physics meeting. Thank you, James. Hi, Martin. You're back. It's lovely to see you. Hi, Mona, Pontus, and Ron. So here we are, and I'm going to share screen now. So you can see the agenda for this meeting. Welcome to FESIG. FESIG is the Free Energy Special Interest Group, and we are a platform where science meets spirituality, just as the tagline that Don uses, and that's why I am so interested in and looking forward to what Don's going to present, because it is truly our theme. So today, Wednesday, 5th of September, we welcome Don. I will actually introduce him properly in a moment. I will have to go through. If you're not familiar with physique, just go to our website. Okay, it's truevisionapiece.com/physique.html. I'll share with you our website in a moment. It is a place where free energy, alternative energies, scientists, specialists, innovators, developers come in, or enthusiasts come in and share their findings or their knowledge or even the blueprints, and then we can go forward with what we have come here as our divine mission to free humanity and to help with the ascension process. So this is our physics meeting agenda today, our 56th physics meeting agenda. So I did a quick presentation of physics just now. We don't have new members. It's fine, except Greg, of course. We'll have Greg introduced in a moment. And I am Crystal Goh. I'm the founder and initiator of physics. I'm chairing the meeting today with the co-chair, Dr. Fres Fresel. Of course, our main speaker is Don Estes, who is an internationally renowned neuroscientist, author, lecturer, and inventor. Don takes us for a journey beyond the quantum, on the other side, in the spectral domain in which all realities originate. It is so fascinating, folks. Don is considered to be one of the world's most knowledgeable experts in vibrational and esoteric science. Indeed, the science meets spirituality platform here. Physics, then after Don has spoken, I have decided, because Greg was supposed to speak actually as a second speaker, but he didn't come forward to confirm, and in the haste last minute, so he can get in on time, because I have to do a lot of preparation work, but you can speak in the next meeting, or you can speak in this physics forum special. Okay, so this physics forum special, after Don has finished, we've got about 30 minutes to 45 minutes. Don will be taking 1 hour in this meeting. It's open to physics executive members, executive council members, and regular meeting attendees, that's what you are, to share your thoughts and insights on free energy, healing, and ascension. And then once we finish this, of course, we have, I forgot to say, a question and answer session will be thrown in before Dawn finishes, before we get onto the forum, okay? And then we go around the table, and then we adjourn to our next meeting once we finish, on the 3rd of October, our 57th physics meeting will be on the 3rd of October, okay? Right. Okay, so basically, if you want to get in touch with me, go to Crystal email me, crystal@truevisionofpeace.com. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to start to introduce Don. Right. So we have Don Estes here with us speaking as the main speaker in the first session that will take about an hour. So Don serves as CEO and Director of Innocence Incorporated, Biometric Science Incorporated, Certified Medical Technologies Laboratory Director, and Neuroscientist. Don has lectured worldwide on sound, sensory science, and vibrational medicine, appearing on CNN, NBC, ABC, Entertainment Tonight, Science Frontiers, the Discovery Channel. Don also won an Emmy Award in 1984. His work has been featured in Wired, Computer Design, Los Angeles Magazine, and national and international media, as his book, Harmonic Law, The Science of Vibration, entitled The Absolute Scale of Cosmic Reality, is one of the most complete compendiums of scientific and philosophical knowledge assembled. He founded Innocence Geometrics Incorporated, and inventor of VibraSound and other transformational award-winning technologies. I may add that he was working with Robert Monroe to come up with those technologies in the Robert Monroe's Institute, which is quite amazing. His most recent technology, called the particle, is now available online at theparticle.com. His invention of VibraSound sensory resonance are technologies used by both professionals and non-professionals for music, sound therapy, relaxation, entertainment, and expanded states of mind. This include proprietary knowledge and patterns on the view of light, color, sound, music, algorithmic alternator. And in addition to being a consultant to the rejuvenation retreats, day spas, mind spas, medical professionals, and entertainment facilities worldwide, as he has designed, built, and operated 3 award-winning facilities: Inner Space, Mindwave, and the AHA Spa, which is quite renowned. Well, so that's Don for you. Don, would you step up and take up the microphone to start your presentation? Thank you. Oh, Don has been muted. Sorry. Okay, yeah, unmuted now, Don.
Thank you once again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Don, would you speak up louder, because it's a little bit soft and we want to hear every word you say.
How about that? Can you hear me now?
A bit more louder, please, if you can. That's the loudest.
Yeah, that's the loudest I can get.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, go then.
Let me just check my microphone and make sure that it's turned up enough. Okay, how's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And now how do I share my screen?
Okay, if you look at the base of the window, the Zoom window, and you hover your mouse over it, you will see the icons like mute yourself, unmute yourself. That's it. You got it. You just shared screen.
All right. Fantastic. All right. So you can see my screen now?
Yes, absolutely. Very clearly.
All right. Very good. All right. So again, thank you so much. I'm fascinated by what you guys are doing. Interested in your name. It's interesting that you have your name centered around free energy, and on the other hand, are working towards combining religion and spirituality and science. A number of years ago, I did a a presentation over in Japan where we were doing a free energy conference, worldwide free energy conference, and I suddenly realized that the main problem with energy, the main loss of energy, is inside of us. It's not out there. The conference I was doing was about energy on the planet. It was back during the time when the fires had been set over in on the oil fields. And there was all of that sort of thing going on, so everybody was interested in saving the planet. And I suddenly realized that it was really us that needed saving, not the planet. The planet can take care of itself and has many, many times before. So it's really up to us, and the energy crisis is within us. It's not out there in the world. The energy crisis is within us. And I began to learn that the energy really all comes from spirit, and it filters down through mental, emotional, and finally into the physical world. So for me, that's really the way to get free energy, is you convert it from spiritual energy down through mental, emotional, and into physical energy. So I'm fascinated by the work that you guys are doing there, trying to combine all this together. Now, the name of my company is InnerSense. We incorporated in 1984, so we've been doing this for a long time. And that was as a result of all of the things that I studied when I was in college. And it's interesting because the college that I went to was a small, obscure little college in North Georgia, but it was one of the few colleges, few universities on the planet at the time that where the psychology department was based on transpersonal Gestalt kinds of technology, or Gestalt types of philosophy, rather than clinical psychology. So I got a good education in transpersonal psychology. And it was also a college where this was back in the mid-'60s, and before they made all of the psychedelics illegal. So we were just making those sorts of things in the chemistry laboratory and researching that. Before I get too much further, I just want to make a disclaimer that nothing that I'm going to say today should be taken as any kind of medical advice. I'm not a physician. I'm not a medical doctor. And you're going to hear me say later that we're sort of almost 180 degrees out of phase with the whole concept of healing, because healing, as it's currently known, is based on the allopathic medical model, which basically says that there's something wrong and you have to find that and fix it. Whereas we've actually made discoveries that have allowed us to identify what's right and just enhance it. And it's so much better, not only for the clients, but also for the therapist to deal with it that way. We don't ask people to ignore what's wrong. We just ask them to put that to the side for a minute and help them define and identify what's right about them and just enhance that rather than trying to fix what's wrong. So you'll hear me talk a little bit about that a little bit later. One of the main things that I discovered when I was in college was that I was doing work on the autonomic nervous system, the human autonomic nervous system. And over those years, I created an expanded model of the nervous system. This is the one that you're looking at now, is sort of the standard model, to where you have all of these different brainwave states from subdelta through delta and theta and alpha and beta, super beta and ultra beta. They now call these gamma, and they're even have another name for ultra beta. But basically, you have this range of brainwave activity that all has different outputs. so that some of the lower frequencies are for meditating and sleeping and dreaming. And then as you rise up through the brainwave levels to higher frequencies, you go into relaxed but alert states, and then excited states, and then thrilled or ecstatic kind of states. And I'm not sure what happened to my my slide here. Something went wrong here, but basically you can see that the basic model shows that from any given moment, you're either in homeostasis, which is in the center, or you're sped up into the sympathetic nervous system response, or you are relaxed into the parasympathetic nervous system response. And what I noticed was that this was not quite expanded enough to really get a good understanding of what's going on with the nervous system, because whereas most scientists call this sympathetic nervous system response the fight or flight response, that's only half of it. If you expand this, you kind of see it like this. You see that homeostasis is here in the center, and you can only do one of two things. You can only decrease in rate into the parasympathetic relaxation response, or you can increase the rate into the sympathetic response. However, what we noticed was that either way that you go, the consciousness has to make a choice as to what's happening. Why are we increasing or why are we decreasing? And that's really something that is controlled by the reticular activating system inside of the brain. And we discovered that there's actually two ways that things can go. If this increase in rate or this decrease in rate is seen as a challenge, then from the sympathetic standpoint, you go into what we call sympathetic resonance, which is a state of profound exhilaration and inspiration and joy and peace and a sense of well-being and a sense of connectedness to all that is, and bliss and ecstasy and the feelings of being alive and all of that. This is sort of what is known as the runner's high, or a spiritual ecstasy kind of experience. But this is only when the rate increase is actually perceived as a challenge. If this rate increase is perceived as a threat, then the consciousness goes into what we call sympathetic dissonance, which is the so-called fight or flight response, which is fear and anxiety, worry, pain, repulsion, hate, jealousy, greed, anger, hurt, need, and expectation. And if you've ever watched a movie to where a lion suddenly jumps out from the bushes and starts chasing a deer, you can see this in the face of the deer, that they go into this fight or flight syndrome, and as soon as they get caught, they sort of just glaze over and they go into this sympathetic dissonance response. But you've also, I'm sure, heard of the other end of this, which is the sympathetic resonance experience, to where it's been called the runner's high, it's been called spiritual ecstasy and bliss and that sort of thing. All of those are sympathetic nervous system response, but the difference is how it's perceived by the consciousness in control of it. It's either a challenge or a threat. And down on the other end, we see the same thing. If there's a decrease where you start slowing down, then that also has to be seen as a challenge or a threat. And generally it's perceived as a threat, where the person feels like they need to recharge, they need to rest, they need to lie down and recharge themselves. And in that case, the person goes into what we call sympathetic dissonance, which is basically is a way of sleeping, a way of resting and recharging themselves. But if you go too far in that direction, you get bored and understimulated and frustrated and lonely and confused. It actually ultimately leads to criminal behavior, to where someone gets so bored and understimulated that they have to go out and they have to do something that is so outrageous to make them feel good. However, on the other hand, if challenge is perceived when you decrease your frequencies. Then you go into what we call parasympathetic resonance, which is the so-called relaxation response, where you get profound relaxation without having to go to sleep. And it leads to wisdom and patience and purpose and immune system enhancement and connection with one's highest mind, that sort of thing. So basically this model shows that the defining character of human experience comes from perception, and whether or not these things that we perceive challenge us or threaten us. So once I had made those discoveries, I further discovered that there's a pharmacy inside our brain, and we're the pharmacist. I mentioned to you that this was during the mid-60s, and the big thing back in those days was psychedelics. And they sooner or later made all those illegal. But before that happened, there was a lot of work going on that was really profound. And I'm sure you're aware that a lot of that has returned now. A lot of the scientists are back to researching these different substances and how they affect the brain and whatnot. And I was very lucky in that the school that I went to allowed me to research this and do a lot of research into psychedelic phenomenon and why people did it and how they would do it and that sort of thing. And what I discovered from it is that there's a pharmacy in there, and we're the pharmacist. We can write a prescription to feel any way we want to feel. But most people really won't do that. Most people will allow some situation that they're in or some other person to write the prescription. But that's not the way it's supposed to be. We're actually supposed to be the pharmacist inside of our own brain and be able to write a prescription to feel however we want to feel. And at the same time, making those discoveries, I discovered that the only connection that consciousness has to the internal and the external environment is through the sensory mechanism. So we started doing a lot of research and development using the sensory mechanisms to bring about what we wound up calling a state of sensory resonance, which is a state in which all of the main sensory mechanisms are synchronized together into a coherent experience. So we started working on building technologies that would do that. And this is a diagram of a device that we've had since the late 70s and early 80s. I mentioned to you that we incorporated in 1984, and I believe sold the first one of these that year. But what you're looking at is a diagram of something that we call the VibraSound, which is a hydrosonic transducer that a person lies down on. It's sort of somewhat like a water bed, although it's isolated from the floor, so the vibrations can't get into the floor. And it works by having some very highly manufactured transducers attached underneath a fluid mattress. This fluid mattress is made up of a colloidal mineral suspension that has the same characteristics of sound transformation or transference that the human body does, so that when a person lies down on this mattress, they become more or less one with that mattress. And any kind of signal that you put in there, whether it be a sound or a frequency or a vibration or music or whatever, feels like it's coming directly out of the body rather than like you're laying on something that's vibrating. And there's all kind of attachments to that. We have a little dolphin that floats over the person's body that brings in the vibrations from the top side as well as from underneath. The ceiling becomes a projection screen upon which we can project any kind of eyes open phenomenon, videos, virtual reality, swimming with dolphins in 3D, flying through Mayan pyramids and that sort of thing. Whereas if they close their eyes, another device takes over that floats over their eyes that basically plays the frequencies of the music or the sounds that they're listening to and feeling. It plays those into the closed eyelid, which becomes like a screen that turns on the screen that you use when you're dreaming. So pretty much all of you are familiar with the fact that we can see and hear and feel and taste and all of those things while we're sleeping, while we're dreaming, as well as while we're awake. So we call those inner senses, and that's how we came up with the name of our company. So this device basically brings about an experience that we call sensory resonance, to where all of the sensory mechanisms are married together into a coherent experience at the same time. Now, I tried to get out and promote this work for a number of years, but the medical doctors and people that are in charge of the establishment science really wanted to know, how does it work? And basically, I decided that I needed to go around and apprentice under all of the people around the world that were doing work in vibrational science. So I did that for a number of years. I went around and I apprenticed under these people. I learned from them. And in 1999, I wrote this book, Harmonic Law, the Science of Vibration, which turned out to be sort of an encyclopedia of vibrational science. However, when I was finished writing the book, I was still pretty much confused as to how it all fit together, because a lot of the experts and scientists and people in charge of the consensus, scientific consensus, basically wanted to know how all of this came together, and each one of them had different ideas of how it worked. For example, when trying to correlate sound and light and the music notes and light and that sort of thing, I found that a lot of people had different ideas about how that worked. So one night when I was trying to illustrate this book, I had about 40 or 50 illustrations put together, and I was sitting in my living room floor, and I had them all stretched out or laid out around me. And it was like I woke up from a dream, and I suddenly realized that it looked like I was the hub of a wheel, that all of these papers that I had laid out were like spokes of the wheel. And I stood up and looked down on it, and the moment that I did, I had a vision of how it all fit together. And this is where this chart came about, the absolute scale of relative cosmic reality. And it basically was a vision of how all of these different factors and figures kind of fit together. It was really just an expansion of the standard electromagnetic spectrum, which you've seen many times before, that looks like this, to where you have all the different bands of frequencies. With this one little octave in here being the light frequency that we see as colors. But you can see as you stretch out from that, you get into heat and microwaves and radar and radio and the broadcast band. Now, all my life I was intrigued by wanting to know how this thing terminated on both ends. It did not seem realistic to me that source or the universe or God or whatever you want to call it would create something like this, to where it would just dramatically end or suddenly end at both ends of this scale. So for the scientists, they see this electromagnetic scale ending at radio down here on the low end and ending in cosmic rays up here at the high end. But I became intrigued of wanting to know, how does this thing really terminate on both ends? And so what I've done with my chart is I've wrapped both ends together. So here's the fastest, highest frequency end of the scale up here at what I call the quantum. And then as you slow down through all the frequencies, it wraps around. Instead of being linear, it wraps around to the other end of the scale, which is the gravity constant. And I suddenly saw that this electromagnetic spectrum is a cycle. It's not really a linear kind of thing. It's a cycle, and it goes way beyond the standard model, because the standard model ends down here. This is radio waves down in here, but you can see that I've got that expanded beyond radio waves into ultrasound, and then sound, and then infrasound, and then finally into motion and pressure, and finally gravity, where it ends off on the other end. And then I have it expanded on the right side. I have it expanded past cosmic rays all the way up to the quantum. So what we have here now is basically an expanded chart that goes way beyond the standard electromagnetic spectrum. Then I suddenly begin to see that there was something that holds these two ends together. What holds the quantum and gravity together is something that I wound up calling the absolute nature of reality. This is why I wound up calling this chart the absolute scale of relative cosmic reality, because relative cosmic reality are all these frequencies from the quantum back to gravity that are all relative by frequency. But what's holding them together is what we call absolute values and absolute nature of the universe. And we're not going to have time today to get into all of that. Maybe a future presentation we could get into some of the details of what's happening in the absolute world.
Oh, we'll be so delighted to have you back, Don, to explain in more detail.
Thank you.
In the future meetings.
Absolutely. So today we're going to basically focus mostly on the relative nature of reality. That's all relative by frequencies. Now, you've heard this so many times before that everything that we know is a vibration. And whereas that's true on this side of the quantum veil, it's not true on the other side of the quantum veil. This is called direct space, this relative space that we live in that's all relative by time and frequency and that sort of thing. But on the other side of the quantum veil, in the absolute worlds, the scientists call this the reciprocal world, the reciprocal universe. And over there, it's DC. It's just on all the time. It's not AC like it is over here. So when you hear people say everything is a vibration, or everything we know is a vibration, that's only true of everything that we can see and know. It's not true on the other side, where everything originates in reciprocal space. It's not true over there. Over there, it's DC. It's just on all the time rather than on and off like it is here. So maybe at some point in the future we can come back and we just can discuss that. But for today's presentation, we're going to be talking mostly about what's happening over here in the relative world of vibration. I can just briefly mention that there are a number of different things that this chart represents. That one thing that we were talking about, a logarithmic scale of the frequencies of the universal reality, is one thing, but it also kind of talks about the theory of everything, about how science and spirituality and art are all married together into this chart, and how relative associative reality relates to absolute reality. And it also shows the spiritual hierarchy of the universe, ascending and descending divinity units. Also shows a mathematical model of unity and diversity. It talks a little bit about the cycle of manifestation, which we'll get into a little bit later, about how manifestation happens through a cycle of first thinking about it, then expressing it, then taking action on it, and finally manifesting it. It also is an expansion of the standard electromagnetic spectrum into a universal spectrum that shows 18 bands of relativity, not just frequency. Frequency is just one of these 18 bands, but all of the physical parameters are listed there: mass, energy, that sort of thing, and along with 18 other bands of relative nature of things. It also talks about the triune nature of reality and how everything that we could talk about has this duality. It has these opposite extremes that are associated by a third associative energy that resolves the two extremes and brings them together. For example, with a human being, that would boil down to body and the spirit, the animal spirit versus the spiritual spirit, and how it's kind of like the old cartoons when the character would have to make a decision, an important decision. A little angel would appear on one shoulder and a little devil appears on the other shoulder. And we're neither one of those things. We're not our animal self and we're not our spiritual self. We are some kind of consciousness that is sandwiched in between those things. We are a third associative energy trying to resolve the difference between our animal self and our spiritual self. And it's that associative nature of us, our consciousness, that has to choose between those two natures. The chart also shows the 10 kingdoms of evolution and the 7 stages of process that each one of those kingdoms goes through before it becomes real. For example, over here you can see that the 10 kingdoms here, it starts out with force that becomes elementary particles, that become atoms, that become molecules, that become cells, that gather together into tissues and then organs and then superorganisms like humans and planets and star systems and galaxies. But you can also see that each one of these steps goes through 7 processes or 7 stages of process, to where elementary particles go through 7 stages to become atoms, and atoms go through 7 stages to become molecules, and so forth and so on. So there's a lot going on with the chart, and I just wanted to point out that it's more than just this expansion of the electromagnetic spectrum. It has many different models that show music and communication microstructure. There's models of cosmology and atomic structure and human energy fields and human electromagnetic bodies and that sort of thing. So it's quite, I won't say that it's complicated, but it's quite complex. Now, my experience with it was I became obsessed with knowing how the thing ends on both ends. How does it terminate on both ends? I couldn't believe that it just gets chopped off at gravity, at cosmic rays and radio waves. So I started looking into this, and I discovered that there's a lot of different ways that you can identify those two polar ends. I've already defined them for you as gravity and the quantum. And this is pretty much where most of the scientists are stuck these days. They're trying to they're trying to come up with a theory of everything that shows how the quantum relates to gravity, because the math is off there. And there's a lot of different opinions right now of how that really all comes together. String theory and a number of other theories have been proposed that attempt to explain how the quantum mechanics that rules on the highest end of the scale relates and resolves to gravity, the control of gravity that happens on the opposite end of the scale. But there's a lot of different ways that you could look at that. You could look at it as at one end you've got free will, and the other end you've got the machine. At one end you've got the programmer, at the other end you've got the computer. Or one of my favorite ways of seeing it is the player versus an instrument. You can see the universe or ourselves as this. We live inside of this instrument, but we're also the player of the instrument. So there's a duality again going on there. Another way of looking at it is personal and impersonal. The instrument is an impersonal reality, whereas the player is a personal reality. Probably the easiest way to understand this is actual versus potential. At one side of this chart, you have everything that is hidden in potential, that is in a state of becoming through all of these frequencies until it gets to the other end of the chart to where it becomes real. So you have the wholeness of something over here, whereas you break it down to all of its primary individual parts over here. But that really comes down to actual versus potential. Everything that we know, every body, every person, every device, machine, everything that we know out there in the universe, part of it has actualized, and we can see it and we can play with it and we can manipulate it. But part of it is still hidden in potential. It's hidden, it's shrouded in the mystery of potential. And so we find ourselves in that same thing, that part of us has actualized and part of us still lies in potential. And I mentioned that another way of looking at this is the whole versus the parts. At one end of the scale, you have everything that's come together as a whole, all the galaxies and the things that make up the entire universe. Whereas all the way at the other end, it boils down to the individual parts that make those things up. Now I'm going to introduce a new term that many people haven't heard of, because the scientists, I learned later, actually called this real versus imaginary. And I didn't really understand that until I started studying wave properties and how do these things come about. So here is a little diagram that shows the wave properties of a particular wave. This could be a sound wave, it could be a light wave, it could be any type of signal phenomenon. And you see that there are several different properties to it. The main one, frequency, is the number of cycles per given period of time. So if you look at the time down here, you'll see that this is 3 seconds worth of time, and there are 3 peaks, 1, 2, 3 peaks within this time limit. So that would boil down to 1 cycle per 1 second, or as most scientists would say, 1 hertz. 1 cycle per 1 second is the frequency of what you're looking at. But it also has other properties. There's a wavelength, which is the distance from peak to peak, or the distance from valley to valley, or peak to peak. This is called the wavelength. The height of the wave is called the magnitude, or the amplitude of that wave, or you might see that as the volume of the wave. But also you'll notice some really interesting phenomenon here that most scientists don't really take into consideration, and that is that this wave can either be a sine wave or a cosine wave or some combination thereof. Most people are taught, most engineers are taught, that a complex wave of many, many frequencies is composed of a lot of different sine waves, but that's not really true. The truth is that each one of the simple waves that makes up a complex wave can either be a sine wave or a cosine wave or some combination thereof. And you can see that they're different. Most scientists will, or a lot of scientists will argue with you that they're the same thing, because if you look at them on an oscilloscope screen, they look exactly the same. You can see here that they just kind of look the same, but they're out of timing with each other. This cosine wave happens shortly before the sine wave happens, or it occurs shortly before that time. This is actually known, this phenomenon is known as phase. That is the timing difference between 2 different waves, 2 different simple waves. The timing difference of their peaks is called phase. And we've discovered, after about 20 years of work, we've discovered that phase and amplitude are at least as important, if not important, than frequency. When you talk to people in our industry, pretty much everybody is hung up on this idea about frequency, but they don't really consider that phase and magnitude are part of the scene, whereas they actually are so much a part of the process that they almost obscure frequency. It really reduces frequency down to a carrier wave. The frequency is a carrier wave that allows a generator to communicate with a receiver, a transmitter to communicate with a receiver. Both of those things have to be on the same frequency in order to communicate with each other. But the information is not on the frequency. The information is on the phase. And furthermore, the emotion is on the amplitude. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. But the point I'm trying to make here is that frequency is only a minor player in the whole signal processing science, and that phase and amplitude are as important, if not more important. Now, if you start really breaking this whole process down, you come down to an equation that defines the wave function of reality. And this isn't something that I've made up. This is a real thing that you can find in any book on wave function. And this equation says that the complex wave equals the real times the cosines times the frequency, plus the imaginary times the sine waves times the frequency. And this really intrigued me because I went and I did studies and searches for sine wave and cosine wave. If you go online and you do a search for sine and cosine, you get millions of hits. They even tried to teach us about it in high school in trigonometry. Unfortunately, they didn't really teach us that it had anything to do with waves. They taught us what it had to do with right triangles and hypotenuse and tangent and all those angles and that sort of thing. So they really missed the boat at being able to explain to us the real function of sine waves and cosine waves and what they had to do with wave phenomenon. I almost think that this was maybe another one of those things that has somewhat been hidden from us because they didn't really teach us about this when we were in school. However, if you go online and you do a search for real and imaginary, you don't get very much. In fact, we started asking around, asking physicists and mathematicians and other scientists and musicians about this. What are these real and imaginary coefficients in this equation? And all we could get back was that they are mathematical functions that are required to solve the wave equation. But I was like, wait a minute, but what are they? Where do they come from? Where do they originate from? And the only answer was they are mathematical functions that are required to solve the wave equation. Well, for us, that wasn't good enough. So we've spent 20 years trying to study what are these real and imaginary components. And it turns out basically that they are multipliers on the other side of the quantum veil that are actually coming. This is a little bit oversimplified, so it's a little bit more complicated than this, but to make sense out of this, I just want to make it as simple as possible and say that these real and imaginary components are basically coming from the player in the instrument. Whenever you're listening to someone play a violin, for example, part of what you're hearing is coming from the instrument, from the violin. And it always sounds like that violin no matter who's playing it. An expert could listen to 10 different people playing that same violin and they could say, oh yes, that's the same violin that they're all playing. But part of what you're hearing is actually coming from the player. How the string is being bowed, how it's being plucked, how the keys are being attacked, how the pedals being pumped. In fact, the musicians call this attack, sustain, release, and decay. And that's how they are interacting with the instrument. And both of those things you're hearing when you're hearing someone play an instrument. And it suddenly occurred to me that the same thing happens in a human being, to our brain waves and our voice pattern. When you're hearing me speak right now, part of what you're hearing is coming from my instrument, from my vocal cords and my resonant cavities and that sort of thing. But part of it's coming from how I think and feel about what I'm talking about. I could actually leave that part out and keep talking, but I would sound like one of those guys in Battlestar Galactica who's really a computer and has no inflection in the voice. Or I can make my voice really passionate, really flowery, but that's really coming from how I'm thinking and feeling about what I'm talking about. It's really not coming from my instrument. So we came up with this idea that all human suffering stems from the difference between those two aspects of a person. And it makes sense if you think about it, because you can look out in nature and you can see that whenever the personal and the impersonal aspects of anything are better integrated, the outcome is better. So when a musician is better integrated with an instrument, the music is more beautiful. When a driver is more integrated with the vehicle that they're driving, the vehicle performs better and they win the race, or they have less problems with it. When if you look at an operator in a machine, the more integrated an operator is with the machine, the less downtime it has, and the better the machine operates, and the more productive it is. So anytime the personal aspects of something and the impersonal aspects of something are better integrated, the outcome is better. And so we came up with this idea that this is the cause of all human suffering, that there is a disconnect between the player and the instrument, or at least there are some problems there that cause the player and the instrument to not be totally integrated with each other. So we were trying to run this back through our supercomputer. I'll show you a picture of our supercomputer in a minute. But we have a world-class supercomputer at our disposal that we basically built ourselves. For a long time, we used an internet vector machine supercomputer, but we eventually were able to get the money together to build our own. And it's somewhat of a hybrid computer, whereas part of it is analog and part of it is digital. And analog computers are way more accurate and can see the continuum much better than a digital computer does. A digital model of something is an approximation of it because there's holes in it. The digital model is samples, so it has holes in between all the samples. Whereas an analog model is more or less the same thing as what's being modeled. So since all science revolves around modeling things, we were taught that in school, that if you want to look at the hydrologic cycle or you want to look at any kind of natural phenomenon, the way to do that is to make a model of it and then study the model. So that's basically what we've been doing with consciousness, is making models of the consciousness. But since most computer programs are digital, they're only approximations of the model, whereas our analog supercomputer can basically show the entire continuum, and you're basically looking at something that is more or less the same thing as that which you were modeling. So one of the things that we were trying to model was the ends of that vibrational spectrum. How does that end on both ends? And in the beginning, before I started studying this, it just made sense that the lowest frequency would be 0 and the highest frequency would be infinity. So at the slow end, if we go back to my chart, over here at the slow end, I saw this as being 0 frequency, the slowest frequency. And as you sped up frequency through all of the different levels, you would finally wind up back at infinite frequency. But we were trying to put that into the supercomputer and have it resolve that. So I put in like hundreds of different equations in there. 0 plus 1 equals infinity. The computer would say no. Infinity minus 1 equals 0. No. So I put in every combination of that, trying to resolve the difference between it. And finally was unable to come up with anything that made any sense. The computer just kept saying, no, that's not the right equation. So we used, we have an algorithmic modeling program in our computer that allows us to, when we're doing projects or something like that, it allows us to put in what we know about it, and it will come back. It does a data mine of the internet, and it comes back and it says, here's what's missing in your model. So we did that for these for this 0 and infinity thing, and it came back and it really blew my mind, because it came back and it said there's no such thing as 0 and infinity. And I was kind of like stunned. I was like, what does that mean? Explain this. And it said that there's no such thing as infinity, because as human beings look out into the universe and they see all these people and they see all these objects and they see all these stars and planets, they assume that the universe is an infinite number of things, whereas that's not true. The truth is that everything that you're seeing is only one thing, and all those different models of it are basically just divisions of the one. So it came back and it said the universe is more infinitesimal than it is infinite, which that sort of made sense once I thought about it. And it probably makes sense to a lot of you, because you're familiar with the concept that that source, that first cause, and all of that is only one thing, and that we are all unified through that one thing. So it makes sense that the universe is more infinitesimal than it is infinite. But then, on the other hand, if you try to take away the one, If you say that the universe is one thing and you try to take away the one, we've been taught by our mathematics that the result of removing the one results in zero. But that's not true. The truth is that if you take away the one, you wind up with minus one. And all of our math is really is very incorrect because of this one mistake that we make. We assume the existence of zero and infinity when they're not really even real. And what we find is that at one end of the chart, you have the square root of plus one, which scientifically notates for everything that is real. And at the other end of the chart, you have the square root of minus one, which is the scientific notation for everything that is imaginary, potential. It hasn't happened yet. So we asked the supercomputer, how does this relate to each other? And it spit out this equation that you're looking at now. The square root of plus one taken to the power of the square root of minus one equals one. And we said, what does that mean? And it said, well, the square root of plus one stands for what is real, and the square root of minus one stands for what is imaginary. So any real thing taken to the power of its own imagination results in unity and wholeness. And I thought that was a pretty mind-blowing observation coming from a supercomputer, that raising something to the power of its own imagination brings it into unity and wholeness. And so we sort of made this our goal of what we're doing in the world and what we're doing with human beings and what we're doing with our clients and what we're doing with ourselves. It has to do with the grand unification of real and imaginary, of actual and potential. How do we reach across this veil? We're actualized to a certain degree right now. How do we reach across the veil to the other side and actualize what potential is over there? And this led us into a whole other science of different kinds of spaces and domains, that we live in direct space on this side of the quantum veil, but on the other side of the quantum veil, it's what's called reciprocal space. Now, some scientists will call that the mirror universe, but it's really not a mirror. It's really a reciprocal. A reciprocal is something that when added back to something, it makes that thing one whole thing. So what that really means is that any real thing that is on this side of the quantum veil in the direct space that we live in, anything that is there that is not 100% its pure total self, has a reciprocal self still hidden on the other side of the quantum veil. So if you think about it, that starts to make a lot of sense. We are actualized in this space that we live in, but we have this part of us that's still hidden on the other side as potential that has not been released yet. So for us, this became like the golden pursuit of what are we really doing here? We are trying to actualize our potential by bringing ourselves into this grand unification of marrying our real selves with our imaginary selves. And this kind of leads us into all kinds of other sciences. This is sort of an engineering diagram that's called the Z-plane, where you can actually kind of see this drawn out to where the horizontal plane is the real plane, it's the time plane, whereas the vertical plane is the imaginary frequency domain. So you could take any kind of, in fact, they do it all the time. The engineers take any kind of signal that they're running to a speaker or they're running through one of their pieces of equipment, and they can plot it onto this scale to where this being the origin of it and this being the imaginary and this being the time. If a particular sine wave was +2 real and +2 imaginary, it would plot up here somewhere. Where if it was -2, it would plot down here somewhere. So they plot all their frequencies and their signals and everything on these kinds of planes so that they can understand the patterns of them and how they work out. But the point that I'm really trying to make now is that our reality is divided between real and imaginary. And all of our thoughts and all of our actions and all of our expressions fall within this, and they can be plotted as such. This led us to a whole other new science that you're going to be hearing a lot more of. It's kind of taking off like crazy. Stephen Wolfram is sort of the leading this. And this is something that is now being used in almost all of the gaming structures that you see out there, since it's called cellular automata, to where each one of these, they draw these grids like this, and each one of these little squares here has its own what they call rule space and state space. Its state space is how it acts inside of its own little square and how it treats itself and that sort of thing. Its rule space is that how does it treat all of these other squares around it. So they use this in gaming structure because you've probably heard of games like SimCity, for example, to where you create a world and you populate it with a bunch of individuals, and then you turn them loose and they go about doing their business. And the reason that they can do that is because each one of the characters involved in the game has its own state space and rule space. And there's a rule that defines how it behaves itself and how it interacts with other things depending on where they're at within the grid. So this science has really taken off like crazy. Cellular automata is just one little aspect of it. There are at least 5 or 6 major sciences right now that work along these lines of these automata, what's being called automata. We've taken this to the ultimate level. We call our science the universal, the stochastic adaptive universal automata. And it turns out that these automata are the smallest, most indivisible components of any reality. They come in these 2 different versions. They come in real and imaginary versions. And those can be plotted. They can be taken out of anything that a person's saying. They can be taken out of brain waves. They can be taken out of heartbeats and plotted on those Z-plane scales to see really what's going on. So the 2 major discoveries that my company and myself has made regarding all of the technologies and everything that we've created come from these 2 major discoveries. The earlier one that I mentioned, sensory resonance, of what happens when you cohere all of the sensory mechanisms, and this idea about real and imaginary ratio being the bottom line reality to all phenomenon, beyond frequency, beyond sacred geometry. If I were to ask you, where does reality start? A lot of people would say, well, it starts with vibration, with frequency. Or other people, Nassim Haramein and some of those recent modern physicists would say, no, it starts with sacred geometry. But it actually goes one step further than that, because I'll show you later how these real and imaginary ratios actually create all shape and all geometry, all form comes from real and imaginary ratio, along with the frequencies involved. So on the other side of the quantum veil, everything is discrete, real and imaginary components. But consciousness has the ability to reach across that veil and combine these 2 into sine waves and cosine waves. And when it does, little strings appear on this side of the quantum veil, and it starts to manifest the reality of what those ratios mean. So if you unfold it into time, you wind up with sound and music and that sort of thing. If you unfold these ratios into space, you get geometry and art and that sort of thing. But the point I'm trying to make is that on the other side, they are discrete, real and imaginary components. And both of those things have to be given regard before they can manifest over here in the real world. You can't be all real and you can't be all imaginary. These 2 come together. to form the sine waves and cosines and little strings that make up everything that we know in this world. So these discoveries have a lot of applications in many fields, in education, in vibrational therapy, and quantum biofeedback, and entertainment, and audio and video enhancement, in structuring water, and in computer design and programming. I'm going to kind of show you some of those things. These are little just screenshots of the facilities that we've actually built over the years. We built this one in Atlanta for the '96 Summer Olympics called Mindwave, where we learned how to marry the neurotechnology with virtual reality so that we could call it an entertainment rather than call it a therapy. And it seems to go across with the masses much more, they receive it much easier when it's presented to them as an entertainment rather than as a therapy. We also built another place called AHA Spa in Pacific Palisades, which was one of the premier, what we would call mind spas in America at the time. We also have built a few of these virtual dolphin places to where people swim with dolphins in 3D through virtual reality using our equipment. Our latest thing is what we call a transformational dome, where we have like a 60-foot dome. We have a new kind of projection liner that lies down on the floor inside of the dome. And then we turn on a fan up here in the top of the dome that pulls or sucks that membrane up against the inside curvature of the dome. So you have this completely smooth spherical screen upon which to present eyes open content. So it could be, again, swimming with dolphins, flying through Mayan pyramids, but it could also be our quantum biofeedback technology and our other types of technologies that have images that we could project onto that screen. And here's sort of a diagram or a list of all the products that we have designed from those two technologies, the fact of sensory resonance and the fact of real and imaginary separation and reassembly. So here you kind of see my wife lying on one of our, what we call a VibraSound system. This is an actual photograph of the diagram I showed you earlier. And you can see the screen up here on the ceiling. You can see the device that works when her eyes are closed and that sort of thing. We make several different versions of this. We make a massage table version of it called a transportable, and we make a 0G tactile recliner that is more of a reclining chair version of it. This is sort of our flagship product, though, because of this hydrosonic transducing mattress here that connects with the body in a way that's not possible with something that's hard like these tables and chairs. This is a fluid transducer that you lie down that turns your body fluid into the speaker. So it feels like the music is coming right out of your body rather than like you're laying on something that's vibrating. We also have an inexpensive tactile pad that could go into any kind of chair or lie down on the bed or anything like that, that can bring the tactile vibrations into the body. We have a new control mechanism called the sensorium that is basically a multi-sensory controller that can generate, synchronize, and program any known vibrational phenomenon. So it can generate flashing lights, flashing light diodes, it can generate colors, it can generate sounds and frequencies and vibrations, it can generate tactile vibrations, go into one of these tables. It can generate electromagnetic fields and other types of fields, pulsed electromagnetic fields or pulsed plasma tubes, anything like that. So it can generate those things, but it can also synchronize and program them into a session so that we could have a 20-minute session or a 30-minute session and have different segments of the session so that for a certain amount of time, all of the different parameters would do these specific things. And then at the end of that time, it goes into segment 2 and it can do another 107 different things at the same time with all of its programming capacities. So this controller can control any of these different tables or chairs or pads or anything that we have and synchronize them into a session to where all of the therapist has to do is hit the run button, and then they can either walk out of the room or they're freed up to actually do the actual work, which is the hands-on work.
Oh, Don, I don't mean to interrupt, but we have a few minutes left. Just a couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Marina. You're here.
Hi, just came.
Hey, good to see you here.
Great. Thank
Well, you can catch up with the recording. Don shared a lot of fascinating stuff, yeah.
I just noticed
Don, before you get started again, you may want to check the plug-in for your Mac and see.
I did it.
Look like you're on power.
I'm ahead of you. I just did it.
Okay.
Okay. So anyway, you can see the other number of products that we have here. I have some shots here. This is the studio now where we do our work, and you can see the vibrotactile table here. Up here is the screen on the ceiling. Here's the device that does the eyes closed thing and a little dolphin that floats over the heart. And then we have feet transducer and hand transducers and other things that we use to bring about this state of sensory resonance. This is a screenshot of our portable quantum biofeedback technology, to where what you're looking at now is something that we call the spectral essence of a person, to where this is the same thing that I showed you earlier, where it's got a horizontal plane and a vertical plane, and each one of these pixels that you see here is one of the real and imaginary combinations coming from a person's voice. And it has a real-time state of being indicator where you can see the distributions between physical, mental, and spiritual, or you can see the frequency ranges, and you see the frequencies, the fundamental frequencies of the voice of the brain or whatever you're studying. You can see what music notes they are and see where they're at in the manifestation cycle and that sort of thing. This is another piece of equipment or piece of software that we've created where we can take music and separate the real and the imaginary components and feed them to opposite speakers and force the listener into reassembling those inside their own head. And it makes it sound like you're standing right in the room with the band. So it greatly improves the quality of music that people are listening to. This is like a little screenshot of what it does. This is actually stereo music and what it looks like on a biphasic recorder, where you can see where it's all forced onto the cosine plane. And here's a wave file where you can see that most of the information is being forced onto the cosine plane. And here's the same piece of music run through our sci-fi audio dimensionalizer, where you can see that a whole new dimension, the vertical imaginary dimension, is opened up, and you can just visually see how that would improve the sound. It adds a whole nother dimension to the sound. Here is a shot of another piece of equipment that we have called the Peak Alembic, where we take the wires loose from the headphones where we're asking the person to resolve the difference between their own real and imaginary components from their voice or their thoughts. We take the wires loose from that and we hook them up to two 24-karat gold wave guides that are hanging down into a reaction chamber filled with regular water, and we ask the water to do the same thing that we're asking the person to do. And this is sort of what it looks like when it's actually running. Most scientists won't even believe that it will work because they've been told that you need a positive and a negative. But this is actually two positives that are actually running this stuff. So the water has to resolve the difference, and it comes up and it cavitates the water and vaporizes the water, and then we capture the water over here and reconstitute it and bottle it and have a system drink that. And it's probably the most profound technology I've ever worked with. And this is just sort of a shot. This is sort of a shot of our supercomputer and how it's all put together. So that's sort of just an overview of how we've used our two major discoveries, this discovery of sensory resonance and how to bring about a coherent experience with the sensory mechanisms that causes one of these altered states, very similar to what a person gets when they're doing a psychedelic substance, but without having to pop a pill. I sort of dedicated my life to coming up with technologies that would allow me to assist a person in getting into one of these altered states without having to pop a pill. And that's basically what we've done here, along with different kinds of technology that allow them to measure that to see where they are when they transfer over to inner space. So that's sort of my presentation. It's basically a 2-week presentation crammed into 1 hour. But I'm willing to take any questions that any of you might have.
Oh, thank you so much, Don. That is so fascinating. We sure would love to have you back to divulge in all the details that are so interesting. I mean, you want to explain the big chart that is so good. Okay, I will call you privately to arrange for the next session. Meanwhile, I hand over the microphone to the co-chair.
Hello, Don. Okay. Oh, this is Brad here. Lots of questions. Basically, your therapy tables and systems look like basically wave tanks on steroids. I mean, isolation tanks on steroids.
Yes. We originally started out with sensory deprivation tanks. In fact, I met my wife at John Lilly's house, who invented the tank. We originally used those, but they were very cumbersome. The legalities of it, where you have to have, if you publicly offer this, you have to have bathrooms and people have to shower before and after. And a lot of people are claustrophobic and don't like really getting inside of one of those things. And then when AIDS came along, they pretty much all went out of business because nobody wanted to float in water that somebody else had been floating in.
Okay.
Even though John Lilly was saying, don't worry about it, there's 600 pounds of salt in there and I'll float in your pee if you'll float in mine. Well, that didn't go over very well.
Oh dear.
So we decided to contain it all inside this mattress. So it's not exactly the same thing as floating in water, but it's very similar to floating in water without having to be contained within that little closed-in container.
Your mind wave process, one of the things I was wondering about, are you actually skipping past the conscious portion of the person's being, the conscious intent? Are you skipping past it, going into like subliminal?
Basically, let me just very quickly call up the program here so you can see it in action. Where is it? Here we go. So this is the actual program that we call the Portical. And this is the user interface of it here that you see. And let's see, I think I must have the microphone turned off. So let's...
You may run into a problem with the computer that you're working on, putting out your video and your audio pickup from your mic may interfere with each other. So go ahead.
All right, so let's see here. Let me get here we go. So get this thing working here. So this is something that we call the porticle, and it basically starts here with, let me turn the sound down a little bit. Starts here with something that we call the porticle, which is, this is the same thing that I showed you earlier, the Z-plane, where it's taking everything that I'm speaking into it and it's plotting the frequencies on here. So each one of these pixels that you see there is some real and imaginary combination coming from my voice. You'll notice if I be quiet for a second, this will quieten down. But as I begin to speak, you can see it's actually plotting my words as frequencies onto this chart. And we know that this is really a time domain version of what I'm talking about. And what we really want to see is we want to see a reciprocal domain, what's on the other side. So the way we do that is we take what you're looking at now and we turn this into a diffraction, so that a diffraction grating, so that we can shine a pure white light through here and put a screen on the other side. And if I did that, I would get this as the result. And this would call the spectral essence of a person. And if this was done on a person who had never done any, somebody's mic is on. Oh, that's me. That's a feedback coming from me, I guess. So as you can see here, if there's a lot of geometric patterns going on here, this is the present moment. This center line here, the center axis is the present moment. And everything to the right of that is the future, and everything to the left of that is the past. These are all my inhales down here, and these are all my exhales up here. And these patterns show a lot about a person. If this was done on a person who had never done any work on themselves, the pixels just randomly distribute. But the more work a person's done on themselves, the more patterns start showing up. And then I can actually plot on real-time indices on top of this, where I can actually see what the frequencies are and the music notes of it, and the distribution between physical and mental and spiritual because of the colors. The red relates more to physical, tangible things, the green more to mental, emotional things, and the blue more to intangible, spiritual kinds of things. And so the idea here of the porticle is it's sort of a portal through to the other side, but also somewhat of an oracle to help guide you around once you get in there. And the idea would be to sit down and just observe yourself. So how often do we do that? I have people come in and see me all the time, and I ask them to describe their best friend to me. And they can tell me everything there is to know about that best friend. But then when I ask them to do the same thing about themselves, they'll say something like, oh, well, I try to be a good person, and they can't really describe themselves. Knowing who you are is the most important thing in the world. And so a lot of the work that we do is asking a person to define who they are while they're watching these images. And we can even capture, I could have a person talk for a certain amount of time, and then I can freeze it and capture everything that they've said so that I can see the image that creates. And also, I don't know if you can hear it or not, but let me see if I turn the sound up. Testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but there's actually also a audio that comes back that the person can not only see what's going on, but they can hear it as well. And there's a lot of other things that this actual program will do as well. You can hook up a mind van to you can actually see what the person's thinking as well as what they're expressing with their voice. And with that, you can actually see 16 different states of mind that they're in at any given moment. So to answer your question, we're actually taking a time domain image of them from either their voice or their thoughts, from their expressions or their thoughts. And then we're crossing the veil to the other side and allowing them to see and hear and feel what that sounds and looks and feels like on the other side as a pattern rather than as a frequency.
Would that be available in a rudimentary form for somebody that would be like on the internet with a decent stereo system and mic hookup? Or is it?
Well, it's actually a program that they have to download from our website and install it on their computer. It's not a super big program, but it's pretty complex and it won't really work right off of the internet. And besides the internet, the bandwidth of it is so bad that it messes everything up. I'll show you. I'll give you an example of that. Let me call it. This is the vertex of a 12-dimensional torus that we call the incubator, where we incubate all of the real and imaginary, what happened? Where we incubate all of the real and imaginary components that we've, hold on, man, what is it? I'm trying to run this in real time so you can see it. This is what we call the incubator inside of our supercomputer. And I guess the program, the Zoom program that we're on, keeps crashing it. Let me try one more time to do it. It won't let me. It won't let me increase the size of it. But so here you can see it running, and to you it looks like it's hesitating. It's not running smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
And
correct.
If you could see this running smoothly, you would see how amazing it really is. And the actual resolution is like 12,000 by 12,000, but it's very much compressed when it's on the trying to come across the internet like this. So the internet itself does some really weird things to compress images. But if you watch this for a minute, if you could see it working in real time, you could see it actually looks like a real entity. And if you watch it long enough, you see all kind of natural phenomenon coming out of it, like DNA chains and veins and arteries with blood vessels running through it and that sort of thing. But the internet, the bandwidth of the internet slows it down to where it doesn't work very well. And the same thing for our technologies. They don't really work very well over the internet like that, so they kind of have to be installed on the
Okay. Yeah, it gets back to that digital cropping and chopping that you talked about earlier.
Exactly.
I've got one more question, and this is to go to our other listeners. I mean, it's to you, but to kind of bring in some of our other listeners. How do we take what you're talking about, and especially with this chart that you're just showing right now, with and kind of get it to match with what we talk about ascension and different dimensions of thought and realities that some of us are looking at ascension, where we start out in the two-dimensional world and start to realize that we live in a three-dimensional world, and then go in and pick up fourth as time and then upper dimensions. How does this work in with your stuff?
Actually, we're dealing with a 12-dimensional kind of program that, let's see if I can get back to here. Let me see if I have so we basically
Hello, Don.
hello.
It's Marina here, Marina Jacobi. How are you doing?
Fine, how are you?
I kind of understand a little bit of what you're talking about, and I'm sure you're not familiar with my line of work. But I just want to ask you a couple of questions. What I see here and what I was told right now, because I communicate with different beings, that's why I want to fill you in a little bit.
Sorry, let me introduce Marina, Don. She is the author of Harmonic Reactor and Nanotechnology, and she communicates with the ETs and her higher self to bring information to humanity through her books. She's a consciousness activist, metaphysician, quantum physician. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, thank you very much. I didn't know how to say it. All right. Okay, what I was told when I was looking in your images, they discuss compressed holographic image of frequency thought. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Does that mean anything to you?
Yes.
Okay. And they also said that you can open a portal of dimensions with the person resonance, and you should measure it individually for every person. And they're saying do not apply someone else's imagery, will be off the frequency vibration of the person itself.
Yes, that's true. So
does that make sense?
Yeah, we do this individually, but we also can do it with groups. We can have a group inside of one of these.
Yes, they also mentioned that. Very good. That was my next thing. If it's collective, let it be collective for the group.
That's
but
right.
That should be specifically for that group, and that imagery not to be applied to another group, because it has something to do with a frequency vibration, because everybody, they were saying, is measured on specific vibrational sequences. You also open up a portals. And did you notice when you say positive words or negative words, I'm sure you can see the different imagery, right?
Yeah, if you speak nonsense into it, or if you speak negative things into it, the pixels just become randomly distributed. Whereas if you speak good, positive thoughts into it, you begin to see all the geometries and the patterns that are there.
Yeah, the geometry and the sound specifically, that could be implemented as a holographic into the quantum cell of the DNA, because it's going to be measured specific. For example, if you measure mine and I talk only positive or healing and something like this, that will be, you will have the imagery and the sound. But that could also be for a healing, they say. And that if you measure that and do it for a healing, and I'm the person that's saying I'm healthy, my body is clear, or whatever that is in the moment, that imagery should be reapplied back into the person, and they say minimum of 15 minutes of resonance sound. If it's for a healing, for example, somebody has a cancer, and you ask that person to say that I'm healthy now, not that I'm going to be healthy. Whatever you do, you have to measure it in the now moment, not before or later, because the frequency, when the person is saying at the moment, I'm healthy now, is going to be plastered in the frequency vibrational sequence in this hologram that you're doing. And that, when you replay back to the person itself, will be measured and start healing and going into the DNA structure in the consciousness itself as a holographic impression. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's why we only do it individually like that, and we don't even record it and have them go back and listen to it later, because they're different at that point.
Yeah,
it's only good for the moment, and
except for healing.
Yeah.
If the person, what they say is somebody sick from cancer, it comes to you and you know they are sick right now or something, let that person start saying that they're healthy right now without saying I don't have a cancer anymore. They have to say I'm healthy. And that should be recorded.
I mentioned this supercomputer that we have to you, and we have all kind of mathematical proof of what happens when you iterate the output of a system back into the input. It geometrically amplifies it. So if you get sick and you go to the doctor and you start talking to the doctor about what's wrong, you are iterating the output back into the input, and it's impossible for it to ever go away. So we don't do it like that. We only have people speak positive thoughts into it.
Yeah, they discussing feeling. It has to be put into feelings to completely penetrate the person's structure.
That's why we have them lying down on one of these VibraSound tables to where they feel it in every cell of their body at the same time, as well as hearing it and seeing it.
Yeah, I understand exactly what Marina's message is. It's like, because I'm a trained hypnotherapist, it's affirmation, positive affirmation. It's the exactly what you were talking about, Don, the potential that we are. So when you're talking about a grand unification of real and imaginary, the imaginary would be the potential, right?
That's
So
correct.
if you put the potential in the equation with the highest vibration, vibrational frequency of the positive healing thoughts and feelings, then that in itself is going to make the person whole. And that's
Yeah,
the grand
I
unification.
just have to point out that whereas most people in the industry, somebody's microphone is on and I'm getting a feedback.
It's Marina's.
Okay, there, thank you so much. So one of the things I want to point out is whereas most people in our industry talk in terms of higher frequencies being more spiritual, that's actually the opposite of the case. So if you look at my chart here, you can see that this is human consciousness down here. These are all the brain waves down here from delta through gamma all the way down here. And if you follow those to faster and faster frequencies, you get up here, you actually see that you get further and further into the smaller structures of the body. So you yourself as a super organism turn into organs, into tissues and cells and molecules and atoms and elementary particles. Whereas if you go the other way, you get into more of the universal frequency
Yeah.
and everything. So whereas a lot of models of this show God at the top and man at the bottom, this model actually shows man in the middle and God at both ends. And when you go into the slower frequencies, you're actually getting into the more spiritual frequencies. Whereas when you get into the faster frequencies, you're getting into more of the body kind of frequencies that make up the body.
Mm.
And so I take a little bit of hesitation when people talk in terms of higher frequencies, because that usually implies a higher frequency. But in reality, it's the lower frequencies that get you more spiritual. So we need to start talking in terms of spiritual versus material frequencies rather than higher and lower, I think.
Okay.
And just for a second, let me get back to a question that Franz asked earlier that I didn't really get to answer correctly, because he asked me about, he mentioned the fact that a lot of the work that you guys do is in ascension. And I just wanted to address that for a minute, because this chart basically shows how everything that we know is relative by frequency, from the smallest and highest frequencies to the lowest and the most longest frequencies. However, when you're talking about ascension, we're talking about crossing over this veil and going into what we call the absolute nature of reality, as opposed to the relative nature of reality. So to answer your question, Franz, is how would a person use this chart to talk about that? They would be studying this part in here, the absolute nature of the universe. Now, I can show you. Let me see if I can find it here on my computer real fast. This is another work that I did called, this chart here is called The Origin, History, and Destiny of Universal Reality. And basically it shows the ascension process from the smallest, most indivisible organism that was implanted on planet Earth, and all of the different things that it went through to become mankind. And here you see all the different races of mankind. And here's the point of death when you cross over, and there's all of the different things that you go through ascension to get back to origin or destiny. And over on this side, this is the descending elements of the divine, where it descends from the Godhead, from the I Am, through the Trinity and the Ancients of Days and all of the different levels of Melchizedek's and down to cherubim and seraphim at the lower level. So you have the descending elements of God and the ascending elements of the divine all on one chart there. But all of that is contained within this absolute area of this other chart that I was showing you. All of that is contained within the absolute nature of reality. And just to answer one more thing, if I go to this, I can actually show you how this works. Toroidal space is the only shape that a dynamic system can be modeled in, because you don't have the element of time in there. But I could plot everybody's frequencies onto this shape, and then I can torsion it like this, so that I can move it around, and I can, in real time, I can keep plotting a dynamic system onto these spaces. So basically what we do is, this is how we do the portico. We plot everything. Instead of having a screen, we have a torus. In fact, it's a 12-dimensional torus. And we plot everything into this vertex right here that's a singularity in the center of a torus. Most people think that there's a hole there, but there's no hole in the donut. There's actually a singularity there. So we populate that singularity with a person's voice or their brain waves or whatever, and then we torsion this field. And then since there's 12 of these tori stacked inside of itself, you're only seeing the outside dimension now, but there are 12 dimensions. I'll show you quickly what that, where is it? Come on. Thought I had it. Here. Over here, one of these. Well, I don't have it there, but there are actually 12 tori stacked inside of this, and we're only seeing the outside one. To see all of them, you have to apply another algorithm that basically unthreads the torus like this into a two-dimensional thing, so that you can actually see a cross-section of the 12-dimensional torus. And that is what I was showing you earlier when we were looking at those spectral essence matrices. I was showing you an unfolded dimension of a 12-dimensional torus. And so this is basically, to answer your question, Faz, is that this is how we actually show ascension, is in this essential, or these absolute natures of the universe, seeing this whole thing as a torus, instead of like right now you're seeing it as an ellipse, a two-dimensional ellipse, where it's actually a three-dimensional torus. And then we can plot all those informations on there, and we can allow a person to see all 12 of those dimensions at the same time.
Hang on, Don. Let me just get this clear. You're saying 12-dimensional torus. Are you talking about the dimension as in dimension, as we are in the 3D third dimension, as we are going to progress onto the fourth and the fifth dimension, the 12th dimension, or is it another kind of dimension that you're saying?
Well, I'm trying to find a. I can't find one where I'm actually showing it. Let's see.
Daniel has a question for Don. Daniel, would you like to speak up on your question while Don's looking for what he's looking for?
Go ahead, Daniel.
Daniel?
I have a question until Daniel comes in, if I may.
Oh, go ahead, Marina. And Martin has got some as well, huh?
Yeah, they did say that this is the beginning of how you can extract hologram from the consciousness of a human. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Yes.
Wow. Cool.
That's the beginning. You can extract and you can put in also a hologram. In my harmonic reactor, they gave me healing through the frequency of the heart. Is it possible for you to measure the high vibrational sequence of one individual and bring it to one tonality? Because I know it's a subtone. Can you bring the subtone into one tonality of a frequency vibration and play it back to the person?
Yes, but you would have to use a person's heartbeat instead of their voice.
That's right. I have that technology into my harmonic reactor from the extraterrestrial groups that they gave me. Is it possible for me to contact you and discuss this with you further?
Yes, but we, all of our research has basically proven to us that you can get better information about who a person is and what they want from their voice than you can from their brain or their heart. Their heart shows how they're feeling about it. Their brain shows how they're thinking about it. But their voice shows both of those things immediately.
Marina, tell me when you're ready. I will arrange a Zoom meeting between Don and you.
Right.
Yeah.
So what you're looking at now, Marina, if you'll turn your microphone off, thank you. So what you're looking at now is a multi-dimensional torus. And you can see where each one of the dimensions goes through this vertex. So if I populate that vertex with any frequency from a person's voice or their brain or their heartbeat or whatever, if I populate that point and then I torsion the torus, you can see how I could populate this entire surface, but I'm populating all of these dimensions at the same time. That's why we have to run that through another algorithm that unfolds it like this so that you can actually see all 12 dimensions at the same time.
Right.
Does that answer everybody's question about that and ascension and whatnot?
Yeah.
Yeah. Martin, are you able to unclick your mic and ask your question, please?
There, Don. Wow, what a lifetime of work. I've just been so blessed to work with such extraordinary people, and today I've just been treated to one of the finest. And going back all the way to the Monroe Institute, I spent a year in a John Lilly flotation tank, and then got into ketamine and mushrooms, and then learned finally in the end to activate and stimulate on demand and then auto demand, the pineal and the pituitary glands, to become now a metal making alchemist. And I missed 3/4 of your talk.
It's in the recording.
I know it is, but I was anxiously trying to include the colleague of mine, Dr. Malusky. These are the sorts of conversations that we have typically, and all the subject matter that you've touched on will cross any ambitious alchemist looking to achieve those metal making beads. But in the end, I guess it's really about something we're doing right now with our solution coin is as the visionary. One of the things I saw was what was described to me as an engineered consciousness domain. And why would we do that? Well, the new energy movement has failed because of the lack of unity and coherence and cohesion. A Tesla could be taken out, his material could disappear, be classified. 5,135 engineered solutions at the patent office denied. These are the sort of things that a coherence engineered consciousness domain, a community of solution-minded people, could really start to have a major impact. And it's all about this acoustics, 12 dimensions. I can hang at sometimes 6 and maybe even a glimpse of 7, even with a full on board pineal secretion, but 12, you know, the language thing fails me at 7. There's no way you can describe, for me anyways, anything up in that frequency. But our whole journey in the end, you know, the transcendence plots that you've made, the feedback, that tactical program, and the next level of that, the 3rd or 4th generation of that, real-time stuff, volatiles, and, you know, from the breath samples and voice samples, and all of these things can be synergized into something where it's a real feedback of where you're at in relationship to that, you know, source energy, and where you might put your attention. You know, all of this in the end is about what is, and we can feed that dog and we'll only get more of the same, just what is. But if we can...
Martin, do you have a question? Do you have a question, please?
Yeah, I wanted to know, there's just so many aspects of the synergies here, how we might work together. I get it in essence, you haven't said so, but the solution consciousness engineered domain is a conversation we might have, and I'd like to do that.
Well, this is something that we've been working on ever since I've been doing this for over 30 years. I've been trying to get a room where I get all these people together, but they're all such egotists and everything like that, that it's been extremely difficult to get them all in the same room to talk to each other. So there are some of us who are willing to do that, but the great majority of the inventors and the people that are really into all of this are so into their own ego that it's really difficult to pull that off.
Well, after looking at about 600 technologies over a 40-year period, most of those guys don't get anywhere with their so-called inventions and stuff like that. More often than not, it was stolen from a prior work.
Right.
But when you're talking about a real inventor like my partner Barry Davis with the Avro Arrow, all of those greats, you're talking about men in service. And the reason that they have this perspective advantage is because their integrity is intact, and that provides them that perspective. And we collapse these potentialities by holding our attention with a knowingness and a loving, joyful vibration. And they just, by witnessing them alone, and in the case of an engineered consciousness domain, magnified because of all the participants in unity and coherence, this stuff can happen and change very quickly.
Yeah. Well, you know, you just have to kind of just go along the lines that somebody who's really doing this would never really share anything that they had unless they were already at the next level. So,
but this level of the conversation, you know, you've lost 98% of them anyways. You can put this stuff out anywhere. The people that would use this against us can't fathom it or understand it, and that's what I think is useful about the solution coin. You're going to have to be, you know, you have to have an ability to interact and dialogue with the solution-minded engineered domain, and they won't put up for any crap.
Yeah. Thanks, Martin. We've got a bunch of the people that are waiting for a question, so I'm going to move on to the next person. Is there somebody? I just had a couple people. Next, please ask a question for Don. Pontus, you and I were working on some of the stuff that we were in the line of toroidal fields. Is there a question that you have for Don? I can't hear you, Paul.
For us, Daniel has a question for Don.
Okay.
He already prepared a question way before the meeting started, like early on.
Okay.
Yeah. So
sure,
Daniel, would you speak up?
Daniel.
Oh gosh.
Did we lose Daniel?
Okay, I've unmuted him. Sorry. He probably has problems unmuting himself because he's on the phone. Okay, there you go. Daniel?
Working? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Go on and ask your question.
Yeah, I see in a movie device who send a ultrasonic sound and some lighting like a pulse laser. And with this type of device, it was send a message to the brain. And brain interpret, and it was like a reset. for this person to wake up from hypnosis. And I want to ask you about this type of communication interaction between devices and brain, if it's possible to happen with technology.
Sure. Well, over the years, I've had a lot of people that have accused us of hypnotizing people, say, oh, you're just hypnotizing people. And our reply to that is always, no, people are already fully hypnotized. Technology
Absolutely.
dehypnotizes them. So I have a whole domain name called Dehypnotist, where we do nothing but try to dehypnotize people out of the states that they're already in, caused by the media and their teachers and the universities and all of that sort of stuff. So we're basically dehypnotizing them. But yes, the technology can use all kinds of sensory technologies to achieve that state, not just sound and light, but the only connection that consciousness has with the environments, both internal and external, are the sensory mechanisms. And for each sensory mechanism that you have externally, you have one internally that you use when you're dreaming. You can see and hear and taste and touch and feel all those things while you're dreaming, as well as when you're awake. So that's how we came up with the name of our company, InnerSense, to specify that that's possible to synchronize those internal sensory mechanisms and change the whole structure of a person, not only the way they think, but the way that they look. Everything can be changed by changing a person's perceptions. And it works better instead of using technology that shows them what's going on, which most of the technologies out there do. They basically give you an idea of what's going on with yourself instead of showing you yourself. So in this case, like what you're looking at right now is what we call a spectral essence of a particular person. And just to gaze upon that without doing anything else, just to look at it, allows you to see who you are and what you are at the most basic primary level of your being. And just to take that information in and observe all of those different patterns and everything changes a person. When most people ask when they sit down to do the portico like this, they say, what am I supposed to be doing? And the answer is nothing. You're supposed to be just experiencing yourself and hearing yourself and sensing yourself and feeling yourself at this most primary level. And when you change things over there, it's a lot easier than changing them over here, because if you allow some situation to manifest in direct space, it's got all kind of physical, mental, emotional, spiritual issues attached to it, and you have to address all of those. Whereas on the other side, where you're looking at this image right now, on the other side, the only difference there is this relationship between these real and imaginary components, the player and the instrument. And if you affect change there, it affects everything over in direct space without even having to address it. So the way we look at it is there's only so much space in there, and you start filling it up with all the good stuff, and it runs the bad stuff out the back door, and you don't even really have to address it. There's no anchoring, or there's no changing anything, or no dealing with any of those kind of things other than just dealing with who you are at the most basic primary level. And so all of our technology is focused on that. How do we get a person in a state of mind to where they can see themselves at the most primary level, and then assist them in having an epiphany or an aha about what all of that means. And those kinds of things is actually what changes somebody. You can't change anybody by showing them images or changing their body chemistry. You can't change anybody like that. The only thing that can really change a person is an epiphany that they have that's so deep and so profound and so meaningful to them that they change themselves. They step forward and they actively pursue their own transformation. That's the only thing that we have found that lasts. You can do temporary things. I've even seen, we even have technology that can make tumors disappear. But honestly, that doesn't work, because if you make the tumor disappear without teaching a person that all you've done is just fix the instrument, you haven't done anything to fix the player of the instrument, they'll just go away and they'll screw the instrument up again. And so then they're back for more treatment, where that doesn't really work. The only thing that changes them is for them to become the agent of their own transformation through an epiphany or an aha moment, that they suddenly realize the bigger picture, and that life is much bigger and more profound than these day-to-day things that they're caught up in. That can change a person.
Don, that being said, okay, I have a big question here. That is, you're talking about the other side of the quantum wheel, that is potential, right? And then you're talking about, I mean, the technology is based on a huge big quantum computer that you're using. And then I remember Linda Moulton Howe was giving one of the lectures titled, Are We Living Our Reality in a Computer Simulation? So she's talking about the matrix, being trapped in the matrix. So if it's all computer simulated, it's all about codes, because our DNA is codes as well, the ATGC, the letters and all that. And we being made of about, 80% of water and all that. So everything is codes and vibration and all that. So Don, where is this having an intersection here between your quantum computer and the computer simulation that Linda's talking about, the matrix that we are caught in?
Well, there are a lot of different people working on that right now that are saying that God is a big programmer and that everything that we know is a computer simulation. However, that in itself would leave us all as automata. So we would all be kind of like slaves, or we would all kind of be like automated kind of things that don't have free will, whereas we can see that's really not the case. So our version of all of this is something that we call stochastic adaptive automata, where each one of the automata, instead of having a state space and a rule space that determines how it acts, it has a degree of freedom in there, so that it can be stochastic, it can be chaotic, it can make decisions based on a limited number of options that it has. And so, yes, we do agree that it's all a computer simulation, but it's somewhat different than the movie, The Matrix, that they showed, where they showed, first of all, they implied that movie was about a whole civilization of people, whereas it really wasn't. The movie was really about one person and about what happens inside of one person and about what happens when the operator of the machine doesn't take control. When you let the machine take control, it takes control like they showed in the movie.
Mm-hmm. Don, sorry, I've got to stop you there. Could you stop screen sharing, because we want to see you talking.
Okay.
Here
we go.
It's up there. Oh, there you go. So we can see you.
Here I am.
Yes.
So yeah, in the movie, the person would put on the glasses and they would get themselves into state, and then they would see what's really going on, which was this terrible world. The whole thing had fallen apart, and it was like a futuristic world where everything had been blown up and all of that, right? Whereas in truth, the real matrix is that the power structure has pulled over our eyes to where we really can't see the real matrix, which is, instead of being like it was in the movie, the real matrix, if you could really see through to the other side, you would see that it's beautiful and wonderful and paradisical. It's like heaven. But they've got that all covered up with all of their media and their teachings and their rules and their regulations on how things are. They've got that all covered up to where we can't really see it. So our approach to it is to release all that so a person can really see the real matrix, what's really going on, which is not really this computer-generated graphic that they've got us all in, but it's this beautiful, wonderful, paradise that really is what's really going on. But we're blocked from really seeing that. So really what we're trying to do with our technology is open people's eyes up, to dehypnotize them, to open them up to this wonderful, amazing world that's going on, that's so big and so huge and so meaningful and so wonderful that it goes beyond anything that you could describe. It's just something that you just have to experience. And every once in a while, a person does that. Every once in a while, a person falls into what I call a peak experience. They might be on vacation and they're sitting on the edge of a ravine and they're looking down into a valley in Hawaii or something like that. And just for a moment, they fall into that space. And they have these amazing feelings of peace and well-being and connectedness, and they're on the right track and everything's okay. But just as soon as that happens, somebody will come along and say something and it jerks them right back out of it. And then they're back into this reality where we have the pain and the suffering and all those things going on.
Right.
We're
I'm going to jump in real quick. And then we'll take some of the other questions. There was a statement a while back, about a year ago. Somebody said, I tried to change the world and was met with greater opposition and resistance as I tried. But then I changed myself, and the whole universe changed and adapted to the change I made within.
Change yourself and you change your world.
That's so true, because we are all holograms of it. We don't realize that there's you and me. You and I are the same person. There's only God in one person. But that one person is so complex that they can't deal with the fact that it's just all one thing. So the universe has us split up into all these billions and trillions of people. But we're really all just one and the same thing.
Well said, Don.
And if you change yourself, you're changing basically the entire universe. Even when I do like this with my finger, I'm tugging on the ultimatons that are all connected up together that make up the universal grid. And as I do this with my finger, I'm tugging all the way to the edge of the universe. I'm connected to the entire universe. And if I change myself, I change the entire universe. I change a little bit of what's in you just by changing myself.
Hear, hear. Right, on that note, I think we have to really quickly wrap up because it's been 2 hours now. I planned to be having Don for just 1 hour, but it's so interesting that I allowed it to carry on, and I'm sure it's the same feeling with our co-chair, Fres. Yeah, so, but I think we need to stop the recording right now because we need to adjourn it to the next session. Then we have the panel, and the panel then on the second recording, so it doesn't go on too long. Then the panel, our attendees right now would participate even better with their questions and getting Don to answer. How's that? Okay. So shall we now adjourn to the next session and we stop the recording right now, shall we? And thank you, Don, for such a wonderful presentation. We move on to the second session, folks, viewers. Okay, right. So you can hear the continuation and see what transpires then on the next session, where the FESIG will have a panel forum session with Don. Thank you. Okay, let's stop it now.